Let's dive right in. This is episode 4 of Blender and Science. It highlights new resources, considerations, and community developments in Blender and the scientific Blender communities. It also includes some general discussion and demonstrations of specific workflows using assets. As always, there are timestamps below. We'll start with some highlights from the Blender and scientific Blender community. It has been a busy 2023. There have been a flurry of developments in Blender itself, as well as asset releases and plenty of exciting new tutorials. Blender is now in its 3.6 version, which has all kinds of exciting new features. The 4.0 release is scheduled for the end of this year, potentially as early as November, and both bring exciting new possibilities. Chief among these, in my view, is the introduction of simulation nodes, which will open up all kinds of new visualization options. I expect that in short order we'll start to see new tutorials and assets that a few years ago would have seemed impossible. These days, my go-to resource for simulation nodes is Ben from Cartesian Caramel on YouTube. If you come to the page and head on over to the live section, you can find all kinds of in-depth, detailed breakdowns of a variety of different effects that really help give an understanding of how simulation nodes work, the underlying logic behind certain effects, and how you can expand this to do your own work. If you are looking for something a little bit more structured, then Arendelle has launched a new platform, nodegroup.xyz, where you can find a whole series of courses on mastering simulation nodes. These do cost money, and I'm not sponsored. I have personally signed up for them. I've been enjoying what I've encountered so far. They're not necessarily the cheapest course ever, but I find the level of instruction is certainly worth the price, at least from my perspective. My initial tutorials with simulation nodes will likely focus on basic effects that will ultimately build towards two significant projects: block copolymer self-assembly and visualizing thin film epitaxial growth modes. I like both of these for different technical reasons, and they reflect a little bit of the work that I've done personally. There are many other features that have released since the last episode of Blender and Science in both 3.5 and 3.6, and I will link to several release videos and timelines that detail those a little bit better, as many of them are more software or artistically oriented. There are some features I do want to highlight though, including the hair nodes from version 3.5, as some of these are potentially very interesting or may offer new capabilities for scientists working with fibers or polymer networks. You can see some of that on display here, with the ability to create or manipulate these complex clusters of essentially fibers in unique ways. Another very exciting feature from Blender version 3.5 is the Vector Displacement Maps edition, which is forcing me to take a much more serious look at sculpting as a viable tool for making figures, especially if science-specific assets can become a part of our own community. Other huge features since the last episode include the real-time compositor for fine-tuning renders on the fly in the viewport, which has only expanded in version 3.6. Again, there are all kinds of exciting new features in addition to this, both of which can be found on the Blender release notes page for version 3.5 and 3.6. Significant file improvements to GLTF and OBJ exports for exporting 3D models to other software, scientific or otherwise, is certainly exciting, and there are a number of improvements, especially in 3.6, just for baseline performance that will really make everything easier to work with. From here on, I'll move on to the scientific Blender community specifically, and there has been a lot going on. I want to start with a summary of asset releases. For my part, I have put out a number of free resources since the last episode, including layer builder nodes, thin film storage boxes for functional 3D printing, proximity distortion nodes, tools for converting PDFs into paper stacks in Blender that you can animate, a general Python module installer, and most recently, fully procedural wavelengths. Many of these have their own dedicated videos on the CG Figures channel, so I would like to shift the focus onto other developments from our community and beyond. I'll be putting links to all of these things in the description. One of the recurring challenges with 3D work is finding good models that you can publish without concerns surrounding the licensing rights. I've highlighted some of these before, but I'm going to add a few new ones. In the 2D space, feathericons.com is a great open source resource for .svg files that you can easily work into your own figures, presentations, or designs. For a more chemistry-focused version, you can also check out Inigo's selection on GitHub, which they've posted on the blender.science Discord. And if you wanted to, at any time, you could adapt Luminous Labs' tutorial on making 2D chemical structures into 3D to make these pop a bit. It's a little bit of an older version of Blender, but it still holds up quite nicely. On the 3D side, the Smithsonian is a fantastic resource for free 3D models. There are easy controls to show only the CC0 public domain options, and the photo scans on offer may be of particular interest if you're on the lookout for models relating to zoology or archaeology. The NIH also has a general 3D repository with license selecting options and a focus on 3D print-ready models. There's good range too, everything from individual molecular structures to printable respirator designs. Many thanks to Secretly Robots from the blender.science Discord for pointing this out. And a similar thank you to Dismem from the Discord for highlighting the Visible Human Project, or VHP, again from the NIH, which makes a public domain library available of cross-sectional cryosection CT and MRI images. These do not require any license to access, and are a convenient segue into the next point on Curtis Holt. Curtis is well known in the Blender community, and together with Cartesian Caramel, has released a number of videos on using Blender to visualize brain scans. Ben, or Cartesian Caramel, has released a free tool called the Scan Data Visualizer for working with CT and MRI scan data, and you can find it for free on Gumroad. This is also nicely complemented by our very own Michael Douglas's add-on MedBlend, which lets you import a variety of medical files that fall well outside my expertise, but are very nicely detailed on GitHub and on YouTube under the Microsingularity channel. We'll linger on human models for a second to highlight the new human assets released and maintained by Blender itself as part of the 3.6 release. These are high-quality public domain CC0 models of realistic and stylized human beings and various body parts that come with a nice quad topology and clean UV unwrapping. I'll use these later in the video for demonstration, as these types of figures frequently make their way into journal covers and general paper figures. And the assets hardly stop there. Ryo Mizuta has been hard at work and has released 3 asset packs. One for face-centered cubic nanoparticles, a starting pack of optical components, and a procedural gyro generator, all of which are visually stunning. It is also great news that Ryo has joined the small group of Scientific Blender tutorial creators on YouTube and is really bringing his characteristic emphasis on visual beauty to the channel. Really looking forward to seeing more work going forward. Carrying right along, Giorgio Luciano, our mod Jojo on Discord, has released and is working on crystal nodes, a whole ecosystem for easy crystal illustration with primitive cells, Brevet lattices, and more to come. I've linked the introduction video and the GitHub page in the description. And again, from the blender.science Discord, we have 2 very cool asset releases from Neria Tavernier, which I'm hopefully pronouncing correctly, aka VisSci Scientific Visuals. These are on Gumroad and consist of a beautiful set of epithelial cells and some fantastic looking procedural falcon tubes for all your 3D centrifuging needs. I'd also like to highlight some of the great work ongoing on the blender.science Discord. The new simulation nodes have prompted a wave of activity, and we've seen some very active conversations towards building effects and figures. There is also a lot of active work on artistic development and stylization that is opening new possibilities for scientific visualization in Blender. For a fantastic example of this, you can head on over to Entropic's channel on YouTube, or find some of the recent releases of procedural animal cell components, as well as different stylization options on Gumroad. And as a last-minute addition, I'll highlight a few bonus demos, tools, and capabilities. Starting with Sam M on Twitter. Using simulation nodes, Sam is visualizing the magnetic fields at work around this coil, and integrated with geometry nodes, this allows for things like seeing the effect of deformation, and also changing the number of loops in the coil. Other than being visually stunning, this is very exciting because the chance to integrate equations directly into Blender simulations opens plenty of doors. I expect we'll see a lot of very cool applications for this, but Sam's entire page, which showcases a lot of visualized electromagnetic simulations, is more than worth checking out. Again, highlighting something from Brady, there's this excellent little tidbit that Blender now supports a pip build so you can use Blender from notebooks. This is very early days still, but there's a lot of possibility for those who are programming inclined. Visualizing inline without all the faff of export is potentially very useful. And lastly from my list is a tool I am unfamiliar with, namely the integrated molecular design platform Samson, which now incorporates the Cycles render engine directly into its viewport. I am not particularly familiar with Samson itself, but seeing one-click access to Cycles in the viewport of a piece of scientific visualization software is pretty compelling. Finally, it wouldn't be a community roundup without touching on Molecular Nodes, which is currently in its 2.7 version. Brady and co. continue to be largely unstoppable. Molecular Nodes is, I would argue, the most impactful and certainly the most widely known tool to emerge from our community. Realistically, it needs its own videos for the incredible new series of features that is developed, but I'm definitely leaving up to Brady himself, who I know is working on those videos. As a quick rundown, though, of some of the things that you can now do in version 2.7, it can work with EM data to visualize even more parts of the cell. It now supports the ability to create custom animation of cartoon styles for protein secondary structures such as alpha helices and beta sheets, which is really just beyond cool. And as if that wasn't enough, Brady is also exploring how simulation nodes will fit into this whole picture, so perhaps in the not too distant future, Blender will be doing some rough or perhaps precise simulations. The man himself is also out giving talks and workshops, and if you really want to see some of the most beautiful science imaginable around the world, keep an eye out for molecular nodes in action, particularly on Brady's Twitter. And to wrap up these scientific community developments, I want to highlight some uses of Blender outside the specific scientific communication for figures that I would normally focus on. Namely, I want to draw attention to both Bobby Broccoli's new series on human cloning and on the work coming from the ThatChemist channel. With Bobby Broccoli, I really don't know what else there is to say at this point. Kevin is doing some of the most interesting documentary work on research culture that you can find, in my opinion. It's free on YouTube, it's over on Nebula, it's a hell of a lot of Blender in action. Check it out. In a turn of events that I was pleasantly surprised by, David, an editor for the ThatChemist YouTube channel, recently came on board our Discord after he and I had a discussion about the use of Blender in creating the tier lists that the channel is so well known for. I unfortunately did not make it out to CSC this year, or I would have gone to say hello to Joey from ThatChemist in person. But if you're after in-depth descriptions of the structures and effects of a whole mess of molecules, there's really no better channel. Joey does a great job of making chemistry much more accessible, and on a personal note, it's very cool to know that Blender is part of that pipeline. As a special bonus, at the end of which 3D molecules are the most cursed, you can watch time-lapse of David editing that video together and working in a combination of Adobe Premiere and Blender. I've said it before, and I'll say it again for sure, but making videos is a huge amount of work, so this type of thing is always impressive to me. Moving right along, this is a rapid-fire section of quick tips, useful little points I've found or come across that might help with your own work. They're in no particular order. Line work for transparent objects on white backgrounds can resolve a huge nuisance. This is particularly true for when you're working with liquid in glassware or vials. If you can get away with it stylistically, it is helpful to render the container or shell using the wireframe modifier or the freestyle set of tools. You can see the wireframe in action here, and I find this does a pretty good job and is fairly fast. If you really need the liquid, then you're going to have to tweak a number of settings using transparent backgrounds, possibly shadow catchers, and then you can often find that it's difficult to clean up the edges. It is possible to do, but this is a nice substitute if you can get away with it. I'm not sure if this is true in the newest versions of Blender. However, in some of the older ones, point clouds do not support multiple materials. However, you can assign variables to control a single shader, and thus separate out different colors to represent the different points. This is also very useful when working with volumes. Text in Blender 3.6 now supports selecting inline. Before, if I wanted to modify my text, I would have to use the arrow keys to navigate to where I want it. In 3.6, in edit mode, I can simply click wherever I would like my cursor to go, and it will move in line with the text, as you might expect from a sort of standard word processing program. There are now also options to add in a selection of special characters, including some superscripts, which you can access by right-clicking and coming to Text, Special Characters, where you can find things like superscript 1, 2, and 3, a number of different currency symbols, and a few other different options, such as the copyright symbol. Ideally, we'd like to see this expanded in the future to geometry nodes and also to a range of other numbers and characters. Particularly, I would like to see every number superscripted and subscripted as well, for making it a little bit easier to write chemical structures. If you happen to be releasing an asset with a default material, try to make sure that it is never this light pink or magenta color, as this is the color that Blender, and from what I understand many 3D softwares, use by default when they can't find an image, texture, or a light source. So if you use magenta by default, you might just end up confusing people. This next quick tip comes courtesy of Bill Barber, or BlenderBrit, on Twitter, and shows that you can use a single value in combination with float curves and 0 to 1 sliders to create custom animation presets. In geometry nodes, if you're adding a new variable to an input, you have multiple group inputs in your node network, dragging out to an existing one will add it to every single version. If you're working with a particularly large node network, you might not want this because it will create a mess. So instead, what you can do is drag out from the input and just type in group input in your search bar, and it will only add to that one. From there, if you really want to, you can go ahead, hit Control H on one of these, expand to find your selection of inputs there, connect it here, hide that again, and it'll maintain a nice clean node network that doesn't have the new additions on every single input that you've created. If you've ever tried to make Bloom work on a transparent background and run into difficulty, there are a few different workarounds, some courtesy of the blender.science Discord, and another one that I personally find useful from the broader Blender community. From Discord, you can see the approach detailed here from Brady Johnston. This is a little bit better known, but you combine an alpha over and an add node in the compositor, as outlined here. Importantly, for this to work, you need to have the Bloom pass enabled which you could find right here. Another version of this can be achieved using the approach outlined in Game Abuse Studios video. You can mostly just skip ahead to about 1140 just to see how the actual working method goes. It does seem to require another program such as Photoshop or any other compositing software that has layers. You can also do it for video. I'm not sure how this would extend necessarily to something like working in PowerPoint, but it does seem to give a somewhat nicer version of the effect if you can get away with working with a still image. Opening the discussion section of this video, I wanted to discuss Nature, and presumably the Nature family of journals, stance on generative AI in images and videos. I've linked the press release, but it's worth noting this from one of, if not the most well-known journal families. The summary statement is, and I'm quoting it here, apart from in articles that are specifically about AI, Nature will not be publishing any content in which photography, videos, or illustrations have been created wholly or partly using generative AI, at least for the foreseeable future. Artists, filmmakers, illustrators, and photographers whom we commission and work with will be asked to confirm that none of the work they submit has been generated or augmented using generative AI. Now, Nature goes on to provide their own reasons for this decision. They've indicated that generative AI systems are being trained on images for which no effort has been made to identify the source, and they reflect on the, quite frankly, indisputable copyright violations at play as well as concerns around privacy. In response to this, I find myself wondering about a few things. On the research side, I would like to see some clarification about what constitutes an article about AI versus one that uses AI. I would also like to see some criteria for using generated images created entirely from in-house datasets. That is an entire research discussion in its own right, but I think it's worthwhile in that context specifically. I'll also note that I'm largely referring to circumstances where the only way a dataset is going to exist is if the researchers themselves generate it. Certainly nothing that is web scraped, more in the context of I, as an individual or as a research team, have collected a series of very specific microscopy images that I want to use to try and train to, say, identify cancerous tissue, something in that vein. On the more artistic side, I can only wonder how this decision may steer people away from or towards certain artistic media or software in scientific visualization. Given the increased attention that AI, or as it's referred to, has received for editing, such as in Photoshop, I'm curious about what the impact of this will be. Either way, something that I thought was worth noting, and for my part, I'll say that this is a decision that I think is probably the right one at this time, and I'm happy to see it. Continuing the discussion section, I want to recommend a video on user interface design. It might seem a bit disconnected from Blender and Scicomm, but I find it extremely insightful and a great opportunity to reflect on design principles in general. The video in question is from a channel called Afterthoughts on YouTube and deals with the design of the stamina bar in Breath of the Wild. It's called Breath of the Wild Fixed Stamina. It's perfect now. We did it. On the surface, you might be wondering why I'm recommending a nearly 20-minute video on a stamina bar in a video game, and how that could make you a better scientist or communicator. But it's because this is such an awesome breakdown of what good design entails and the impact it has. As Sam says in the video, circle is good, but why circle is good is the part that I want people to make note of. I'm happy to have people watch the video and draw their own conclusions, but I've reviewed it about 5 times myself, and I learn something new every time about how I want to design my own work, whether that is an asset I'm releasing or a journal figure I'm working on for publication. Especially in scientific papers, clarity and simplicity are essential. There's limited time in a day. There's tons of work getting published all the time. If a reader can look at your figures, immediately know what's going on, and understand what you're trying to say, then your paper is a better paper, and they're much more likely to return to it and rely on it. I can't speak for anyone else, but for myself, figure design wasn't part of my formal training as a scientist. Presentation skills certainly were, with an emphasis on professionalism and high standards of visual clarity. But there's a big difference between that and capturing a reader or viewer's attention and directing it to important areas as needed. So, just so this doesn't turn into a huge rant, I'll say go watch the video, then watch it again. Circle is good, the video is great. The last major topic I want to discuss a bit in this episode is the role of the asset browser in the Blender scientific community, and how we can take advantage of that to compile all of the free scientific resources that we've seen released in the last few years. I am currently working on adapting my own assets into a prototype version of this that will include many of the tools and models that I've developed to date, along with some generic procedural shaders and science-specific shaders. I anticipate that this library will only continue to grow considerably with the introduction of simulation nodes. I also want to expand it to include things like basic 3-point lighting setups and backdrops. Many of these already exist in Blender through add-ons or other integrations, but a dedicated library for scientists makes it easier for beginners to get started, or for more advanced users to get set up quickly has some value in my eyes. For the initial release of this, I'll be sticking primarily to my own work, models that I've made and released already, along with some specific scientific shaders, new projects, and occasionally a few CC0 public domain things that I might bundle in because they are particularly useful. For instance, the HDRIs that ship natively with Blender. When everything reaches a point where I think it's organized sufficiently, I'm going to release that and potentially start a community call to see if it can be expanded. There are a number of considerations that will be going into this, and I'll be touching on those in the future, but for now, I want to showcase how the asset browser can be used for quick setups when you have the right library on hand. And to do that, I'm going to make a few simple recreations, firstly of some solar cell and transistor figures using the layer builder presets that I've created, and then I'm going to make use of the human assets recently released by the Blender Foundation to show how you could quickly get up and running to make something like a figure for flexible electronics that you might see on any cover. A very common, simple element that I'm going to use to demonstrate how you can use the asset library to make a figure very quickly is a basic device stack. So I encounter these all the time working with solar cells and transistors. This is from my website. You can see a selection of these that are in published papers, but these are very, very useful figures and you see them crop a lot. Blender is really well suited to making them and we can do it very, very quickly. So let's go ahead, move to Blender, and we'll showcase that using the asset library approach. So in a new scene in Blender, the first thing I'm going to do is, of course, delete the default cube. Then I'm going to come to this asset importing window. I'm also going to go ahead and change the render engine to cycles, just because I prefer it. Now, the asset importing window doesn't come by default with Blender. It's something that I created specifically, and then when I wanted to make sure it was in all of my default files, I simply went to File, Defaults, and saved it as part of my startup file. So every time I open Blender, I can access this if it's on the PC that I primarily work on. Now, this has a number of things that I like about it. There's a viewport for basic scene setup. I have an animation timeline. I've got geometry nodes and shader nodes. And of course, I have my asset library so I can bring things in from the browser. Now, I'm going to choose my library specifically. This isn't perfectly organized yet, but it has exactly what I want for making thin films, namely device stack generators. And I want to make, let's say, a pre-built solar cell. So I'm going to come in and drag in this perovskite, using this because it's a relatively complex example. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just move this background sphere out of the way. I'm using that for the perovskite. I'll grab the full device stack and hit Alt-G to move it to the center. And if we zoom in and hit Z and come into render view, you can see there's this little white perovskite down here. That's the actual underlying object. It's not going to show up in the render, which is good, but I want to hide it in the viewport as well. Now, otherwise, I have pretty much everything I need. I've got a basic set of devices. I've got a number of materials. So you can see that I've adjusted this particular setup so that all of the materials are accessible from here. So if I want to, I can change anything from this panel. So everything that is being used is very readily available. And of course, if I want to make changes to something like the perovskite itself, then I can either do that through the geometry nodes, or I could do that through the modifier panel. Let's say I want that layer to be a little bit thicker, and I need my perovskites to be tilted. So if we zoom in here, you can see that has now been added, incorporated, and the layers work perfectly together. If I want to change some aspect of the layers, I can do that through the layer building geometry nodes, all of which are heavily customizable here, or I can adjust it down here. And so, of course, there's all kinds of options for that. Let's say I wanted to separate these along the y-axis. I could shift them just like this. You can see I've got that nice uniform separation. So for now, I just want a pretty basic figure, so I'm going to reset this back to 0. I'm going to hit Control-Alt number pad 0 with this in my viewport, and that's going to line my camera up pretty much where I want it. If I really want to make fine-tune adjustments in the viewport, I can hit N, come to View, grab Camera to View more or less. That's going to lock me in there. Then I can sort of adjust here. And just like that, I'm almost ready to render. But there are a few things I want to do first. In the Render tab, I'm going to come down to Film. I'm going to make this transparent, just so that I don't have to see too much of the background there. In fact, I want this to be a PNG with an alpha channel, so I could put this on a slide or in a figure if I wanted. And the other thing I want is to actually make some changes. So I'm going to ultimately swap that perovskite out. But first, I want just a little bit of, let's say, something in terms of better lighting. So one of the ways that I like to do that is with HDRIs. Now, these are all free HDRIs that I have essentially ported into my own library. You can also purchase something like the Polyhaven tools that give you a variety of different HDRIs under different conditions. So let's say I want something indoor. I'm going to go with studio lighting. Let's go with this first option. I'll drag it into the scene, and the lighting has been added pretty much right away. I find a lot of the HDRIs are a little bit overpowering at first, so I usually bring the strength down to 0.5 in the World tab. That's not bad. And so almost there, pretty much right out of the gate. We're going to make a few little changes here. So the one thing that I want to show is that if you have a compiled asset library of different people's work, and again, many of these things are available for free, then you can essentially just build up whatever you need. So I'm going to look for the unassigned section here, and the free asset that I want is right here. So this is the one from Ryo Mizuta. This is the procedural gyroid. You can see, again, even though this is not my asset, it works well in this space where I've got access to the materials, I've got access to all the geometry nodes underneath. And what I actually want to do is grab this, reset it to position. Again, I'm going to hide this in both the render and the viewport. And then in my layer nodes for the perovskite, I'm going to swap out the lattice there, right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the gyroid instead. So you can see, I've got that right there. And there we go. So now it is sandwiched in that stack. It's a little bit big, so I'm going to go ahead and grab the original object and just scale it down a little bit until it kind of fits my device footprint. And I can do this through different views as well. Let's say top orthographic. I can see it's just peeking out of the side there. Perfect. Let's see how that looks from the front. Now, again, I've got all my layers. I would have to obviously relabel this because it's no longer a perovskite, but if I wanted to, I could make some changes here as well. I'm actually overriding the material, so you can see it's this interesting black color as opposed to the white, but if I wanted to, I could set it up with anything I want. So let's go ahead, grab set material here, and we're going to use the gyroid material that Ryo provided. So now I have this, and I can change the label to gyroid. And so very quickly, I've set up a relatively complex figure, got all my layers. If I wanted to, I could separate them all out, or I could move or hide different aspects of them. So let's say I want to move the gyroid so that there's a distance between it and the bottom layer here, this substrate, and this upper transport layer. Let's go ahead and find those. So this is my lower transport layer. I want to add a layer separation. Let's see, we're going to add a layer separation here of, let's just say 0.1. And then I'm going to add another layer separation into the next layer of that same value of 0.1. So there we go, 0.1. And now I've got this isolated on its own. And of course, same thing as before. If I want to, I can use any of the controls that Ryo has exposed here, so I can make these kind of different or accessible, and I can change aspects of this however I want. And I can substitute in any object that I wanted. So this is a very convenient way to make these layer devices very quickly, but this is a nice showcase of how you can do that with just the asset library. And so without all the narration this time, I'll go ahead and show very quickly how I would do this. And we're just going to see it for a transistor figure. I'll set it up probably in under a minute. So essentially, in no time at all, I've already got to the point where I've rendered something out. It's on transparent background. I could put this in a manuscript, and this would honestly be not bad compared to a lot of what you see published for these types of figures. This took very little effort because many of the tools are just drag and drop, so you can create this, set it up, and what I'd like to see is this kind of thing build up further. Now we're going to go back and look at the default human assets that the Blender Foundation itself has made available, and we're going to see how you can quickly adapt those into sort of a very common figure element that I'll showcase first. The only reason this is still going is because I have a ridiculous number of samples. I could have used 200 for something like this, and we would have been done ages ago. So let's switch over, and we'll see the other part of the asset library in action. I'm using this next example because it's a cover element that I've seen quite a lot. This is part of my reference board from primarily the Advanced Materials family of journals. I work in materials specifically, and so I pay attention to a lot of what goes on in covers and figures because it helps inform the tutorials that I make and the assets. One of the things that you encounter quite frequently in materials research is how the material interacts with a person. Be that through sensing, some sort of smart textile, maybe it's just the distribution or the way that humans are building their devices specifically, but a lot of it is day-to-day interaction, and a lot of it relies on very generic elements of the human body. Often it's a hand kind of interacting with something in a day-to-day event, or it's just demonstration of clothing and smart textiles. So we're going to see how you can use the human assets released by the Blender Foundation to quickly get something set up and where I hope that will go moving forward. I'm going to very quickly showcase a rough use of the human base meshes in Blender and a quick trick to sort of put some clothes on the model in a way that you might see in a journal cover. So we'll treat this as though we're going to do an actual journal cover. I'm going to go ahead, grab my camera, and under the settings, I'm going to change this to be a 300 dpi letter size page. So 8.5 here times 300 for the X, and 11 times 300 for the Y. That's going to essentially give me letter size. If I come to my camera view here, you see, already set up there. So that's perfect, my camera's right. I'm going to delete the default cube, and I'm not going to use the asset importing window this time. We'll go all through Blender's generic options. So let's go ahead, grab the asset browser. You can see I've got all kinds of things on display here, but for now, all I want is HDRIs. So again, these are just available free. I just made them into assets. I'm going to drag one into my scene. If I were to come to the render view now, you'd be able to see that. Let's see, are we in EV or cycles? We're going to use cycles again, just because I tend to prefer it. And I actually don't want this background. I'm going to go ahead, come to film, make it transparent. So now we're ready to go ahead and import our human model, and we are going to do that by adding a library. So you would download the file from Blender. Let's go take a look at that. On the blender.org page for the 3.6 release, you can see we've got this bundle up thing, and this is the basic version of the asset library. You would go ahead, you'd grab these, and you can simply download right here. So once you have this downloaded, we're going to go back to Blender, and to import this, I would come to Edit, Preferences, File Paths, and then I would add an asset library, human base meshes. You can see it right here, wherever I had that saved. Once I've got that done, I can open that. And now you can see I've got all of the options on display. So it comes with stylized and realistic models, various body parts, and some more specific features such as a relatively realistic skull. I can't really comment on the anatomical accuracy. I don't know if they really got all of it, but this would be an excellent start if you were sculpting. What we're going to do is bring in the human male, the realistic version, snap it to the center with Alt-G. You can see right away that this has been imported as a collection. I'm actually going to hide this window now because I no longer need it. And what I'd like to do is realize this. So Control A with it selected, make instances real. You'll notice that the eyes are separate from the model. For whatever reason, I'm going to select both by holding down Control. Then I'm going to Shift and select my body in the viewport, Control P, just parent these to objects so they don't go walkabouts. And then I'm going to right click and auto shade smooth on this guy. Now, what I'd like to do is set him up to very quickly have access to, let's say, some basic clothes. So it's a pretty generic model, and I could see this being used in almost any cover. What I'd like to do is add a shirt and some pants, and if I tab into edit mode, you can see that they already created nice seams for the UV unwrapping. That is super convenient, and we're going to use it to make a very cheap and easy shirt and pants setup. So I'm going to go right around the midriff here, Alt-A deselect everything. I'm going to hit 2, so I'm selecting edges. See that up here. Then Alt and Shift left click. I've got my perimeter right there, right click, and I'm going to mark seam. So you see I've got a new one. Now if I hit L, I can select linked, and I can choose what I want, and that's by seam. So I've got his entire front here. I'm going to go ahead and grab the rest of this for the pants. Now to make the pants, very simply, I'm going to Shift-E to duplicate this. That'll move with me. Right click to drop in place. P to separate by selection. Now I can go ahead, grab these. They're a separate object, so I'll rename them pants. And I'll rename this body. And I'm just going to make these a little bit bigger by tabbing into edit mode, A to select everything, Alt and S. I'm going to drag that up. I'm also going to go ahead and get rid of the multi-resolution modifier that comes by default. And right away, we've got some decent looking pants on this guy. We can do the same thing for a shirt. So I'm going to grab the body. I'm going to take advantage of the seams that are here. In fact, I want him to have sleeves that are a little bit further down. So Alt-Shift left click here, matching this on the other side. There, right there, perfect. Right click, mark seam. Let's do the same thing with L. I'm going to grab all of the linked areas. And I've got a basic outline of a shirt here. Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead, Shift-E, duplicate that. Right click to drop it into place. P, separate by selection. This is my shirt. Tab into edit mode for the shirt. A to select everything. Alt and S will drag that out just a little bit. And then just to make this a little bit more convincing, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab this aspect of the shirt, Right at the bottom, Alt Shift and left click again just to select this bottom row. O to turn on proportional editing. I'm going to scroll down on my mouse wheel just so I'm modifying just this bottom part right there. Scaling that out, moving that down just a little bit so it sits over the pants. And again, let's lose that multi-resolution modifier just so it looks a little bit more loose-fitting. You could try and figure this out with cloth simulation as well. I think that's probably more of a headache than it's worth. And we can also add in a little solidify modifier just to give this some thickness. So that's probably way too thick. Let's drop this down to, let's say, 0.0125. Not bad. And we can go ahead, select all of that, Alt S, scale that in just a bit. There we go. We've got a pretty default looking fella. I'll drag this out again just to kind of correct because we overshrunk. Right there. There we go. Perfect. We've got a pretty default looking figure, and this is the type of thing that I would expect to see in a journal cover. From here, we could add in basic materials so this guy would look a little bit more kind of ready to go. Let's go ahead, grab our camera view, and we'll set this up in a kind of default pose. So here, might expect to see this from the top. Kind of a prominent figure off and off to the side, so we'll do this sort of thing where he's on the side of the shot. And so from here, you could very easily set this up that you are simply dragging and dropping shaders into the viewport to give this guy some particular character. This is the Mat 3 Classic, as I like to refer to it, based on the shader developed by one of our mods on Discord, who makes beautiful animations of jelly proteins. But this is sort of a very easy, simple setup. What I'd like to see going forward from Blender specifically is the integration of this with some sort of generic rigging that may or may not happen, but these are very useful. So similarly, you could grab the hand here, and you could imagine how this would be easily adapted to something like one of the figures that I showed at the beginning, where you've got some sort of human hand touching a specific thing. And if all of these are rigged at some point and come that way, then that would be excellent because you could simply pose them the way that you like. One thing that I might do on my own if I have the time is just set up armatures for these so that they can be rigged or in kind of standard stances that you might expect. So sort of the Michelangelo finger Sistine Chapel setup that you often see with touching thin film electronics for creating sensors. So that is something that I hope to see more of going forward. And this integration, especially because this is going to be maintained by the Blender Foundation, is really excellent. It's going to make it a lot easier to make many of these cover or figure elements. And with that, thank you for coming out. There was a lot I had planned for this episode that I didn't quite make to. I will be trying to integrate some of that content into future videos. It's been a busy year, and I haven't had nearly the time I'd hoped to commit to this project, so more than ever, I really appreciate the support of those on Patreon who helped me justify some of the things I get to do on behalf of our community. I announced it already on the channel, but CG Figures became a gold level supporter of the Blender Dev Fund this year, and that is only possible because of the support on Patreon, so thank you again to them. So with that, if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing, sharing with your friends and colleagues, joining our awesome community on Discord, checking out the incredible people I featured, and until next time, you have yourselves a great old day.